The email arrived on a Tuesday, not to me. To one of our clients, a regional logistics company we had been working with for 3 years. The email came from a new address, a domain I had never seen, a company I had never heard of. The client forwarded it to me by accident. They thought they were forwarding it to their own team. They hit reply all instead of forward. I read it at 7 in the morning with coffee I had not yet touched. The email was from my business partner of 15 years, a man named David Marsh. It outlined the services his new company would be providing going forward. It referenced the work we had done together. It described the transition as already underway. It was signed with his name, his new title, his new company. The company had been incorporated 4 months ago. I know this because I had been counting for 6 months, not because I had suspected David specifically, because something in the numbers had been wrong and I had not yet found where. I found it that Tuesday morning. I set down my coffee. I opened the folder I had been building since January. I added one more tab. Then I called my attorney. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 44 years old. 15 years ago, David Marsh and I started Cole Marsh Consulting from a shared desk in a co-working space in Belltown. We did operational consulting for mid-size companies in the Pacific Northwest, supply chain, logistics, process efficiency, the kind of work that is unglamorous and essential and that builds slowly through referrals and reputation. We built it, both of us. That is true, and I want to say it clearly because the rest of the story requires it. David was the relationship side. Dinners, golf, the kind of sustained personal attention that turns a client into a 12-year client. I was the delivery side, the frameworks, the implementation, the documentation that made the work repeatable. We were not interchangeable. We were complementary. For 11 of those 15 years, the partnership worked the way partnerships work when the people in them are honest. Not always easy, not without disagreement, but honest. The last 4 years were different. I did not understand how different until January. In January, I was reviewing our year-end financials with our bookkeeper, a careful woman named Ellen, who had been with us for 7 years. Ellen said, "Nathan, there's something here I want you to look at." She showed me a pattern, not a large one, not dramatic. 3 clients who had reduced their retainer levels in the same quarter. 2 who had declined renewals without explanation. 1 who had not responded to a renewal outreach at all. Ellen said, "Individually these are normal. Together, I don't know. It feels like something." I looked at the numbers. She was right. Something. I did not go to David immediately. This is the decision I have thought about most in the month since. I could have gone to him that January and said, "These numbers look unusual. What do you know about these clients?" I did not. Not because I suspected him, because I had learned over 15 years that David's answers to operational questions were always smooth and always sufficient and always moved the conversation forward without fully resolving the underlying question. And I was tired of smooth answers. I wanted to know what was actually happening before I asked. So I started counting. Not conspicuously, not formally. I simply began paying closer attention to things I had trusted David to manage. Client communication logs, renewal timelines, the notes from relationship calls that David summarized for me in our weekly meetings. The summaries were accurate. That was the thing. They were accurate in what they said and incomplete in what they did not say. Every summary described the client relationship as healthy. None of them mentioned that David had been having separate conversations with those clients about a potential transition. I did not know about the separate conversations until March. In March, one of our longest-standing clients, a shipping company we had worked with for 9 years, mentioned in a routine call with me that they appreciated David's flexibility about the timing of the new arrangement. I said, "Which arrangement is that?" A pause on their end. The client said, "Oh, I assumed you both..." Never mind, I'll let David explain. I made a note, and I added a new tab to the folder, and I kept counting. If you have ever watched numbers that were supposed to tell one story slowly begin to tell a different one, you already know why this story exists. Subscribe and hit the bell. I'll be here every week. By April, the folder had 4 tabs. Tab 1. The 6 clients from Ellen's January observation. Retainer reductions, declined renewals, non-responses, dates, amounts, communications. Tab 2. A list of David's external meetings for the past year, reconstructed from calendar entries, expense reports, and the client communication logs. 41 meetings I had not been included in or briefed on. This was not unusual in itself. David handled relationships, I handled delivery. But the pattern of which clients appeared in those meetings and when was unusual. Tab 3. A corporate records search I had run in March after the shipping company call. I had searched David's name and variations of it against the Washington Secretary of State Business Registration Database. Nothing in March. I ran it again in April. A company called Marsh Advisory Group, LLC, had been registered on February 14th. David Marsh, registered agent. Home address. I added this to tab 3 and did not contact David. By May, the folder had 6 tabs. I had identified 7 clients who appeared to be in active transition conversations with Marsh Advisory Group based on the pattern of communications and the corporate registration date. The combined annual retainer value of those 7 clients was $1.4 million, approximately 60% of Cole Marsh's annual revenue. I showed the folder to my attorney, a man named Richard, on a Friday afternoon in May. Richard looked through it carefully. He asked questions. He made notes. Richard said, "Nathan, this is methodical. The documentation is clean." I said, "I've had 6 months." Richard said, "The question is what he's actually done versus what he's planning to do. Has he solicited these clients in violation of your partnership agreement?" I said, "The shipping company mentioned a new arrangement. I believe at least 3 others are in active transition." Richard said, "I need you to pull your partnership agreement, specifically the non-solicitation clause and the client ownership provisions." I pulled it that evening. The partnership agreement had a non-solicitation clause. 18 months post-dissolution, no solicitation of existing clients. It also had a provision about client relationships being assets of the partnership, not of individual partners. Richard called me the next morning. Richard said, "Nathan, if what your folder shows is accurate, and the corporate registration date combined with the client pattern suggests it is, David has been soliciting partnership clients for a company he formed while still a partner. That is a material breach of your agreement, possibly multiple breaches." I said, "What do we do?" Richard said, "We don't do anything yet. We wait for one more thing." That one more thing arrived the following Tuesday. The forwarded email from the logistics client. I called David at 9 that Tuesday morning. I said, "Can you come in? I need to go over some things with you." David said, "Of course, everything okay?" I said, "Just some numbers I want to review." 10 o'clock? David said, "I'll be there." He arrived at 10, on time. He always arrived on time. He came in and sat down across from me at the conference table we had bought together at a liquidation sale in 2012 for $300, and which had been in every office we had ever shared. I placed the folder on the table. David looked at the folder. He looked at the tabs. He looked at me. I said, "I want to show you something." I opened to tab 3, the corporate registration for Marsh Advisory Group, February 14th. David said nothing. I said, "I found this in April. I've been adding to this folder since January." David said, "Nathan." I said, "Tab 4. I turned to tab 4, the client communication pattern, 7 clients, the timeline of David's external meetings, the correlation between the meeting dates and the corporate registration. David said, "I can explain." I said, "Tab 5. Tab 5 was a printed copy of the forwarded email. David's new company name at the top, the services outlined, the transition described as underway. David looked at it for a long time. The conference room was very quiet. I said, "I'm going to ask you one question. I want you to think about your answer before you give it." He looked up. I said, "How many clients have you had transition conversations with?" A long pause. David said, 7, maybe 8. I said, "While you were still my partner?" David said, "Yes." I said, "Using relationships you built on behalf of Cole Marsh." He looked at the table. David said, "I was going to tell you, I was going to propose a buyout, a clean separation." I said, "When?" David said, "After I had enough clients committed to make the offer viable." I thought about that. I said, "So you were building your exit using our clients, our relationships, our 15 years of reputation, and your plan was to offer me a buyout once you had taken enough that the company I was left with wouldn't be worth what you were paying for." David said, "That's not how I thought about it." I said, "How did you think about it?" He did not answer. I picked up the folder. I placed a second document on the table. Richard's letter. Formal, clean, specific. I said, "My attorney prepared this. It outlines the specific provisions of our partnership agreement that you have breached and the remedies we are seeking. You have 72 hours to respond through your own counsel." David said, "Nathan, we can work this out between us." I said, "We could have, in January or February, or any of the 6 months during which you were building a company with our clients while sitting in this office and telling me everything was fine." He looked at the letter. David said, "You've been planning this for 6 months?" I said, "I've been documenting for 6 months. There's a difference. If this moment stayed with you, leave me a comment. Has someone ever used the trust you built together as the material for something they were building without you? Tell me how you found out." I read every single one. David retained an attorney by Thursday. The negotiations took 11 weeks. Not because the facts were disputed. David did not dispute the corporate registration, the timeline, or the client conversations. He disputed the valuation methodology and the remedy structure. His attorney was competent and the arguments were legitimate. These things take time when the numbers are significant. The settlement was reached in September, 8 months after Ellen had shown me the pattern in the year-end financials. The terms. David's exit from Cole Marsh on an agreed date. A client allocation. Certain clients would follow him to Marsh Advisory Group with a structured fee paid to Cole Marsh reflecting the value of the relationships built under the partnership. The remaining clients stayed with me. The non-solicitation clause was enforced for the agreed period. The Cole Marsh name was mine. The total settlement value, including the client allocation fees and the non-solicitation damages, was $890,000. Not everything I had built, not the partnership I had believed I was in, but a clean accounting of what had been taken and a structure that protected what remained. I kept the name, not out of sentiment, because the name had 12 years of reputation behind it, and that reputation was mine as much as it had been ours. 3 of the 7 clients David had been in transition conversations with chose to stay with Cole Marsh after the settlement. 2 of them told me directly that they had felt uncomfortable with how the transition had been handled and had been waiting to see how things resolved. Ellen stayed. She had been with us for 7 years, and she knew the numbers better than anyone. In November, she flagged another anomaly, a small one, unrelated to David, in a vendor contract. I thanked her and fixed it the same week. Some habits are worth keeping. I am 44 years old, and my business partner of 15 years built his exit using 15 years of work we had done together. I want to tell you the things that are actually useful. The first thing, trust and verification are not opposites. I trusted David for 11 years, and that trust was earned. The last 4 years of the partnership were different, and the difference showed up in the numbers before it showed up anywhere else. Ellen saw it. I saw it. We did not act on it immediately. There is a version of this story where I go to David in January and have a direct conversation, and we resolve it cleanly. I do not know if that version exists. What I know is that I was tired of smooth answers, and so I chose documentation over confrontation. For 6 months. The documentation made the eventual confrontation straightforward. No denial was useful. No smooth answer covered what was in the folder. 15 years of trust had been present in the room. 94 pages of documentation were also present. The documentation survived. The second thing is about partnership agreements and what they actually protect. Ours had a non-solicitation clause and a client ownership provision. Those clauses protected me. Not because David respected them, clearly he had decided not to, but because they defined what had been taken and provided a legal basis for the remedy. If you are in a business partnership without a written agreement, make one. Today. Not because you distrust your partner, because the agreement is not about distrust. It is about clarity. It defines what belongs to the partnership rather than to either individual. That clarity is what allows a clean accounting when the partnership ends for any reason. The third thing is the hardest and the most honest. David and I built something real for 11 years. The work was good. The clients were served well. The reputation we built together was legitimate. And then he decided, for reasons I have had to accept I will never fully understand, that the exit he wanted required taking something that was not entirely his to take. I am not able to tell you why people do this. What I can tell you is that the folder was not about revenge. It was about having a place to stand when the conversation finally happened. About being the person in the room with the documentation rather than the person receiving a surprise. 6 months of counting gave me that. I would count again. Hi everyone, thank you for being here. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to document something quietly for months before you had enough to act? And which moment stayed with you longer? Finding the corporate registration in April or watching David's face when he saw tab 5? I read every single one. If this story reached you today, subscribe. What comes next will stay with you too. Nathan Cole, Seattle, Washington.